This short film gives us information about the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1970, brought into being by Alfred Morris, later Lord Morris of Manchester. As the film begins, we're shown a close-up of the Act, and we hear the voice of actor Rory Kinnear. Rory's voice is heard at different times throughout the film, reading sections from the Act. The film cuts between shots of Alf Morris and of other speakers. Alf is shown in the House of Lords on the 40th anniversary of the Act in 2010. A silver-haired white man in later life, heavily built, bespectacled, wearing a smart grey suit and patterned tie. Around him are red leather button-backed benches, and behind him carved wooden panelling. A line of wheelchair users are in attendance to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Act, all holding copies of Alf's speech. Other speakers whose voices we hear during the film include Mike Caine, MP, the first speaker in the film, a middle-aged white man with short grey hair, Alf's daughter Jill, in her 40s, white blonde hair, worn up, she's seated outside in her mum's garden. We hear from a range of disabled people, different ages, from different racial backgrounds. Some are filmed in their homes, some are outside, and one wheelchair user we hear from is travelling by train. They are, in order of appearance, Charlie Hatton, Claire Harris, Annabelle Inskip, Dr. Hamid Haroon, Kirsty Hutchison, Rosie Jones, Dennis Queen, Isaac Harvey, Deo Koleosho, Prakash Radhinakrishnan, Awa Janyi, Bill Blackwood, Ella Glendinning, and Thomas Puttock. A deaf Asian woman signs, "I couldn't even imagine if the government didn't recognise deaf and disabled people. That would affect me. My life can be down. Lots of barriers, communication breakdown, lack of BSL interpreters." Sahira Khan. Other voices are those of Kate Green, MP, whom you'll recognise from her Scottish accent. She's tall and slender with short grey hair. Sir Richard Stilgoe, seated at his grand piano, white hair and beard. And Saba Salman, a journalist, seated on a wall outside, aged in her 30s, a British Asian woman with sleek black bobbed hair. At one point, Alf speaks directly to us from his office, smartly dressed as ever, shown in an archive interview from 2007. Additionally, black and white photos show Alf and his brother Charles, aged in their 30s. The credits read, Contributors in order of appearance: Mike Caine, MP, Alf Morris, Jill Morris, Charlie Hatton, Claire Harris, Annabelle Inskip, Dr. Hamid Haroon, Kate Green, MP, Kirsty Hutchison, Rosie Jones, Dennis Queen, Isaac Harvey, Sahira Khan, Sir Richard Stilgoe, Deo Koleosho, Prakash Radhakrishnan, Awa Janyi, Saba Salman, Bill Blackwood, Ella Glendinning, and Thomas Puttock. The credits continue. Archive, Getty Images, ITV Granada Reports, 2007, the Morris Family Archive, and the Parliamentary Recording Unit. Thanks to Access All Areas, Cross Street Chapel, Sarah Hawley, Derek Kinraid, Eamon O'Neill, St Luke's Church of Wythenshawe, the Morris family, the Orpheus Centre, Lucy West and Janet Woolstonholme. The composer is James Holt, dubbing mixer Pip Norton, online editor Sue Giovanni, archive researcher Benjamin Spiro Hughes, development producer Richard Helder. The director of photography is Martin Veselinov, the editor Rebecca Ginn, director James Dan, executive producers Jules Hussey and Karen Shannon. Logos appear for Manchester Histories and Brazen, the film producers. Copyright is 2020. Audio description by Anne Hornsby of Mind's Eye.
The Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act was the first piece of any legislation in any modern legislature that recognised the human rights of disabled people, and it's that legislation that was copied by parliaments across the planet.
Winning first place in the private member's ballot is the most coveted prize in the lottery of parliamentary life. And that was the prize I won in November 1969, giving me the right to parliamentary time to introduce a bill of my choosing.
It was really a bit of a fluke. There was a private member's bill, which was a Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act at all, because Dad was actually away when the private member's ballot was taken. So his brother, Charles, who's also elected, the MP for Openshaw, he was working in the whip's office. So he thought, oh, right, in a brotherly way, I'll put in the ballot for Alf.
I was attending an inter-parliamentary conference when the ballot took place, and it was on my way back that I found on the plane a copy of the previous day's Manchester Guardian that reported that I'd won the first place in the ballot, and there was speculation about what kind of bill I would introduce on my return.
I was resolved to try to legislate on the problems and needs of long-term sick and disabled people, as, in my view, the most deprived and neglected minority in Britain.
Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, 1970.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty,
the provision of practical assistance for that person in his home.
Sir Alf changed people's attitudes as well as the law.
Since that time, other legislation, such as the Discrimination Act, was another huge piece of legislation that gave disabled people equality, and the Equality Act as well that have come in, are all following on from what Alf started.
The really important thing about the Act was having it at all. It was a piece of legislation on the statute book that said disabled people's rights deserve to be protected in law.
The provision for that person of lectures,
outings or educational facilities.
The fact that disabled people could now get an education just like everyone else, and with able-bodied people is huge.
Previous to the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, which Alf first brought to Parliament and then was made into an act, we were only really covered under the 1945 agreement around the welfare state and healthcare, which meant some things were covered, but they were only covered if they were within that, and also it meant there was no cover without that. So there was no understanding of disability as a wider social issue or as something that might have a bit more to it.
The whole point of the social model of disability is that we have to adapt society to meet the needs of disabled people. Not that we have to lock them away because they can't cope with society as it is. The Act understood that.
the provision for that person of facilities for travelling to and from his home.
Now we have buses and trains which are accessible, but back then they weren't even accessible, because I remember a time when there were steps to get onto buses and trains didn't have any level access.
He said something once, Alf, and it works just as well if you're in a care home or if you're a disabled person. He said, we can't add years to their lives, but we can add life to their years.
Assistance for carrying out of any works of adaptation in his home designed to secure his greater safety, comfort or convenience.
Every local authority shall have regard to the special needs of chronically sick or disabled persons.
For the provision of new houses which make special provisions of the needs of such persons.
If it wasn't for Alf, I wouldn't have my house.
It introduced the concept of inclusivity, access and visibility, so people were no longer hidden away.
Any person undertaking the provision of any building shall, in the means of access both to and within the building and in the parking facilities and sanitary conveniences, make provision
for the needs of members of the public visiting the building or premises who are disabled.
Where any local authority undertake the provision of a public sanitary convenience, it shall be the duty of the authority in doing so to make provision
for the needs of a disabled person.
There shall be a badge of a prescribed form to be issued by local
authorities for motor vehicles driven by or used for the carriage of disabled persons. My blue badge is a huge factor in my freedom and independence.
Special educational facilities for children who suffer from autism or from acute dyslexia.
It was the first time that autism and dyslexia were legally recognised.
If this act didn't happen, I would have been sent to a mainstream school where I would all the kids would never understand me, and all their staff would be ill-trained and not knowing how to deal with a person with autism.
This act may be cited as the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1970.
People are always very rude about the 60s, as if we just lay about doing absolutely nothing. It was a time of huge change of ideas. 1965, the first Race Relations Act. 1967, decriminalisation of homosexuality. 1970, right at the end, Alf Morris.
If it wasn't for his act that came to power in the 70s, I wouldn't have took part in autumn outreaches. I wouldn't have joined this drama group. I wouldn't have graduated Orpheus. I wouldn't have graduated Woodlands Mead. If it didn't come into act, I'll be festering around in my home with my parents, with no friends and no relations, and me on the ranks of becoming rather, meaningless and bland. Which I am definitely not.